thinkers in Nishida, and in particular, we now have Dylan St. John presenting on what is nothingness, an inquiry into Zen metaphysics as seen through the perspectives of the Kyoto School of Philosophy.
Tough act to follow. Now for some intro level Zen philosophy. First of all, I'd like to thank my parents for filming my suffering so I can observe this later, my own path towards Buddhahood. Next, before I begin, I'd like to tell a little story. A couple of years back, I studied Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and actually practiced here in town under Reverend Izumi. I ended up leaving. I was quite tired of reciting the Nibutsu over and over again. But just recently I saw him again, and we spoke for a while, and we joked. He kidded with me and said that my teacup was too full, and he told me, "You need to empty that thing." I had told him that I was interested in the philosophies of Nishida Kitaro, and he looked at me very seriously and he said, "If you read Nishida Kitaro, you will understand Buddhism." What a promise that was! So I took it upon myself to answer the question about Buddhism itself. So what is nothingness? That was a joke. You guys, you can laugh. Funny enough, but I do believe there's some merit in this slide, which we'll get on to a little later. So, Sanskrit term, sunyata. I will mispronounce words. If I'm confident of anything, it's that. This is a Sanskrit term translated as emptiness, a term that refers to the central Mahayana teaching that all beings are empty of or lacking permanent, independent existence or substantial self-nature. Now, the Japanese word mu, or as we know, made famous by Joshua in one of the early koans, this is known as nothingness. In the Zen context, the Japanese term mu, translated as nothingness, is to be understood as sunyata. This concept has a rich history with many different interpretations spanning the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. This makes it extremely difficult to disambiguate what is actually trying to be said, even within the Kyoto School, which is 20th century school of philosophy that attempts to ground mu in philosophical understanding. Zetai Mu, which is what I'm focusing on specifically, known as absolute nothingness, is the foundation Zen principle for the Kyoto School of Philosophy. Most, if not all, do entertain this idea of absolute nothingness. Typically, they use the term in several different senses to designate: one, the openness or open ground for all things, in contrast to a metaphysical ultimate ground principle based in being; two, the creative and generative non-temporal origin of all things; finally, three, a distinction from the relative nothingness that is defining correlation to being, to absolute nothingness. So, philosophy in Japan. It is common that Western philosophical practice assumes universality, in the sense that these concepts are absolute and pure, or discovered and beyond context. Preceding the 20th century, the practice we know to be philosophy was rather ambiguous in Japan due to its contextual creative nature. During the mid-19th century, the term tetsugaku was used by the Japanese to describe the academic tradition, philosophy, of the West that was recently imported into Japan. Although many disagree, before the importation of Western academic philosophy, Japan had a rich literature that I agree would be best defined as philosophical rather than theological. For this paper, I would like to assume that Japan has always and still possesses a strong indigenous philosophical culture that is uniquely Japanese and equally as valid as its Western counterparts. Although some of the basic assumptions that were being made by these philosophers may seem as though they are grounded theologically rather than logically, making the division between religion and philosophy quite distorted, I would like to grant that there is a non-difference between the methodologies. Both philosophical and religious traditions are grounded in basic assumptions that are faithfully assumed to be true, which does not necessarily follow that they are. Therefore, arguments are validated upon faithfully assuming basic assumptions to be true. Both religious and philosophical traditions are guilty of this. As Tanabe, one of the mid-Kyoto school thinkers, asserted, religion and philosophy entail each other, eliminating any real fundamental differences between the two. This also means that the Kyoto school is as representative as Zen as it is for philosophy. It is for these reasons that I believe the Kyoto school of philosophy holds a position that, although strongly grounded in Zen tradition, is still a valid philosophical tradition contemporaneous to Western philosophy of the early 20th century. Just as Plato appealed to the forms for the base of his philosophical understanding, the Kyoto school of philosophers appealed to Zen for the basis of theirs. To these fundamental differences, the Kyoto school of philosophy stands in mostly opposition and firmly independent of Western ontological concepts that will be discussed. So relationship to Zen and existential philosophy, just a quick note. Although absolute nothingness is built upon a foundation that is clearly Zen, it is important to reconcile the relationship that absolute nothingness has with Western philosophy, most notably the philosophies of Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. So the Kyoto school of philosophy itself, founded by Nishida Kitaro, or better known, maybe not better known, but known as his Buddhist name, An Inch of Mind, in the early 20th century, and I argue much more than an inch of mind, spans 4 generations of thinkers and survives today. Generally focuses on the ontological notion of absolute nothingness, includes thinkers like Nishida Kitaro, Tanabe Hajime, Nishitani Keiji, Masao Abe, and Uday Shizaturu. Most, if not all, were either disciples of Zen or displayed a deep respect for Zen. So the first one I would like to observe is Nishida Kitaro. Cited as his inspiration, Zen gave Nishida the foundations for his philosophical understandings. In his deep respect for Zen, Nishida very early began to reckon Western ontological theories of reality grounded in being and developed a me-ontology, or non-being that looked to contextualize reality rather than ground it. He looked to the Zen notion of Mu, or nothingness, in order to conceptualize his philosophy of absolute nothingness. In his early work, An Inquiry into the Good, he begins to explain his ideas of absolute nothingness. In this, he explains his theory of pure experience, which in short is to suggest experience precedes the dichotomies of dualities, which I would just like to note that this is qualitatively similar to some of the existentials around the same time, including Sartre, where he described existence precedes essence. Very similar. D.T. Suzuki later affirmed that reality as emptiness is to say that it goes beyond dualities and that pure experience is sunyata, or emptiness. Pure experience is sole reality and is more fundamental than individual differences. Individuals exist because there is experience, and in this way Nishida has avoided solipsism. Experience means knowing facts just as they are, whereas pure experience is facts just as they are, void of discrimination or bias. This means that when an individual is to make a judgment of value, experience ceases to be pure, because when we make judgments, we are collapsing the purity of experience into dualism. Although if granted, pure experience has no intrinsic meaning and cannot avoid nihilism. Nishida abandons his ontological notion of pure experience in favor of his developed thought, known as the logic of Basho, or place. The logic of place challenges the Western metaphysics that suggest reality is grounded in physical being. Nishida believes that beyond physical space is a place in which all physical space is located. This is the place of absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness is the place in which all reality is grounded in being and nothingness. Qualitatively similar, Nishida's place of absolute nothingness is very similar to Plato's topos, which is to suggest a matrix of all becoming. Plato's topos also suggests a place that holds both the subject and object, which make it qualitatively similar to Nishida's absolute nothingness, and he did recognize this. This I believe to be an important point in order to showcase the relationship that the Kyoto school had with Western philosophy. And like I had said, although uniquely Zen, there is a lot of Western stuffs in here. The next thinker I would like to take a look at is Tanabe Hajime. He stood as a contemporary of Nishida's, and in 1927 he succeeded Nishida as the chair of philosophy in the Kyoto Imperial University. His ideas were in part critical responses to Nishida's logic of place, which would eventually create a fissure in the relationship that was never mended. Although their relationship became strained, Nishida's philosophy still stood as the foundation for Tanabe's logic of the specific. And as Nishitani later points out, aside from their bad relationship with each other, they still seem to stand on the same philosophical ground. Where Nishida's logic of place was based upon the realization of absolute nothingness, Tanabe's logic of the specific attempts to suggest that absolute nothingness was not transhistorical pure concept. This is in contrast to Nishida's understanding of absolute nothingness. Tanabe raises other concerns with Nishida's place of nothingness. Tanabe suggests that once you attempt to ground nothingness as being, it loses its status as nothingness. For Tanabe, if absolute nothingness is always nothingness, then that which is negatively opposed it must be being. Therefore, absolute nothingness must also hold the self-negation of the being, for nothingness is a negation of being. Tanabe, like his teacher before him, ends up rejecting his own logic in favor of his work that focused on the division between religion and philosophy. He goes on to develop his seminal work titled Philosophy as Metanoetics. Abandoning Zen ideals of self-power, Tanabe shifts towards Shin Buddhist ideals of other power and develops his philosophy that is not a philosophy, or metanoetics. The next thinker I would like to observe is Nishitani Keiji. Like most of the Kyoto school, was intrinsically attached to Zen Buddhism. Through the readings of D.T. Suzuki, Nishitani cultivated a deep respect for Zen, and through the readings of Nishida Kitaro, he developed the language to talk about it. Nishida studied under Martin Heidegger for 2 years, which is interesting, and through this experience became aware of the unique relationship that religion and philosophy had. In his use of Zen, he interpreted what he had learned from Heidegger and developed a philosophy that was articulated in his work The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism and his seminal work from 1961, Religion and Nothingness. While studying with Heidegger, Nishitani became interested in the creative nihilism of Friedrich Nietzsche and other existentialists like Steiner. Nishitani recognized that nihilism went further beyond religion and metaphysics and praises Nietzsche's creative nihilism in its attempt to overcome this type of nihilism in Europe. Nishitani recognizes the similarities between European nihilism and Zen's absolute nothingness. He sees Zen in a similar light as he does with Nietzsche's creative nihilism in relation to Zen as a self-preservation of the great doubt. Although Nishitani brings forth similarities that seem to suggest qualitative indifferences, he believed there is a fundamental difference between nihilism and absolute nothingness. Where nihility is absolute negation, nothingness is absolute affirmation. This is to say that in contrast to being, absolute nothingness is that which is beyond being, allowing for the many things in the real world to retain their true being. Where the Europeans overcame nihilism through nihilism, developing a creative or affirmative nihilism, Nishitani believes that the Japanese have yet to do so. The next thinker I would like to observe is Abe Masao. And after abandoning Shin Buddhism, so he's taking a different direction as Tanabe, Abe found Zen as a new source of inspiration. It was with his deep respect of Zen that brought him to the proponents of the Kyoto School of Philosophy. Although he had a deep respect for the first-generation philosophers, including Nishida and Tanabe, Abe's focus was on the philosophy of Nishitani. In rejecting Plato's notion of the forms, Abe believed that absolute nothingness is formless. He believed that nothingness should not be in contrast with something, and that it is not directly observable, it must be realized existentially. Abe asks that in order to understand absolute nothingness, we must first recognize that this does not necessarily mean that all reality is empty, but rather that all reality is just the way it is. Abe understands this as suchness, or the Sanskrit term tathagata. And unlike clouds or plant life, human beings have difficulties realizing their suchness due to the reality that we possess self-consciousness. It is our value judgments that take away from our suchness. In a biblical sense, we could blame Adam and Eve for eating the fruit of knowledge. But we may praise them for our ability to create will. The realization of our suchness is also the realization of emptiness. This is absolute nothingness, and it is the ultimate reality beyond the whole physical world, allowing for no fixed positions to exist in truth. Of course, by definition, nihilism would once again follow. Finally, the last of the Kyoto School thinkers, he's still alive today. And after studying the existentialists and Western mystics, Ueda Shizuteru turned to his Zen practice and began his own work on absolute nothingness. Ueda believes that Zen Buddhism gives the nihilistic concept of nothingness an existential value. This is to suggest that absolute nothingness is to be seen as someone rather than something. Ueda also studied the language of Zen and found that within the language it reveals things. These things reflect the whole in which it is a part of. Words become hollow and reflective of absolute nothingness, in which all being is found. In the language of Zen, he found that language promotes suchness or actuality. It is with the most recent words of Ueda that I can start to pull strings together and hopefully form a non-contradictory image of what absolute nothingness is, which is extremely difficult in a 3,000-word paper. The first generation of the Kyoto School of Philosophy saw thinkers such as Nishida and Tanabe, who would begin to forge the path towards absolute nothingness. With Nishida, we found that absolute nothingness was to mean a place which was beyond all physical reality, where both subject and object exist without discrimination. Although deeply grounded in Zen, Nishida gives us a philosophy of non-being in direct contrast with Western conceptions of physical reality of being. In response to Nishida, Tanabe recognized a problem with the language of absolute nothingness. He recognized that it is contradictory to grasp which cannot be grasped. As a concept that is formed through negation, Tanabe believed that if nothingness is true nothingness, its negation must not be being. Thus, absolute nothingness must be its own negation. Unlike Tanabe, who ended up rejecting his teacher, Nishitani was to kick off the second generation of the school and very diplomatic towards his teachers before him. Reacting to their philosophies of absolute nothingness, Nishitani was drawn to the philosophy of the West, specifically that of the existentialists. He studied with Heidegger for 2 years and developed his absolute nothingness in reference not only to Zen, but also the existentials. He compared the nihilism of Europe with the nothingness of Zen and found that both traditions possesses traits that are qualitatively similar, believed that Zen could learn something from the existentialists in their quest to overcome nihilism. In the third generation, we saw Abe, who contributed this idea of suchness. And finally, in the fourth and current generation of the Kyoto School, Ueda suggests that absolute nothingness should be viewed as someone rather than something. It is important to note that the relationship that the Kyoto School held with other schools of thought, I can't stress that enough, because although it is uniquely Zen, there is a lot of influence from other places. So finally, I'd like to make some safe conclusions that hopefully the Kyoto School would agree upon. Probably not. Absolute nothingness is to be understood as beyond the physical realm and beyond grasp, but also encapsulating all phenomena. That is to say, both it and its negation are one of absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness is subjectively realized rather than objectively observed. So through the act of language, even through this essay, absolute nothingness is no longer absolute. And I would like to just point out on the slides, language is a problem when trying to talk about it, and I'm sorry if I've wasted your time. Discussing absolute nothingness becomes a fallacy. Absolute nothingness is unbiased. Valuations of good and bad are of no being, and nihilism follows. Thus, all individuals' perspectives become equally valid. Absolute nothingness implies suchness, which is to say that beyond valuations of our consciousness, everything is just as it is. In conclusion, absolute nothingness is best understood as a different ontology, a philosophy of sunyata, a non-negated ontology that is beyond dualities. Sunyata is both being and non-being, restricted to intuitive understanding beyond grasp. This makes absolute nothingness not a negated ontology, but rather a different ontology that avoids dualistic tendencies of negation. It follows that the world in and of itself is simply just that, and the myriad of phenomena that are left open for interpretation, including that of the Zen perspective.
Great, great. And we still have time for questions and comments. Any of
I was afraid of that.
No, that was fantastic. This is sort of a side comment. I was just wondering in your research if you came across how Heidegger is treated in contemporary Japanese philosophy. Like, I know that in the 30s and 40s he was pretty popular. Do you know how he's actually treated, like currently?
No, I know I don't.
Okay.
I'm totally unsure about that.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was
The question I have is, did you run across Thomas Merton at all? And his idea of the virgin point?
No, I didn't. Mostly I was looking at the works of James Heisig and Abe Masao himself, and their commentaries of the school.
When you talk about the Zen influence on this Kyoto school, obviously they're also influenced by Western philosophy and so on. But, I mean, to some extent they're mining old Buddhist texts.
Yes.
Or are they, I mean, because Nagarjuna is all over this stuff. In some sense, it seems like everything is, you know, it's the old dictum about Western philosophy being a footnote to Plato. It seems that a lot of this is really Buddha Mechanica Karika is being kind of mined repeatedly in some sense. And do you get that feeling, or are they reading contemporary Zen teachers? I mean,
You know,
who are they going to in terms of...
the generalization of the Kyoto school is that they took Zen metaphysics and earlier Buddhist metaphysics, of course. With here I have Dogen and Shinran, but also I cannot pronounce his name, Nagarjuna. And they took that and they put it through the machine of Western analytics. That's the generalization of the Kyoto school. So almost completely opposite of what the West was doing at the time, where they were like, well, let's reject logic for a bit and do this intuitive thing. Japan was saying, let's leave that aside for a second and put this through the analytic machine. So, but definitely, yeah, they are mining deep into Buddhist concepts.
With a couple of different thinkers, you mentioned Shin Buddhism. I think
Yes.
one guy left it for Zen, and the other guy left Zen
Yeah.
for Shin. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about sort of what was at stake there, what really differentiates Shin from Zen for those thinkers, or just in general.
Yeah, so for the main generalization between Shin Buddhism and Zen Buddhism has this ideal of self-power. So you and yourself are capable of attaining Satori, or enlightenment. Where Shin Buddhism, the fundamental assumptions there were that there was an other power that existed that you needed to, and once again, Reverend Izumi, who I had practiced under a while ago, said that faith is never the right word, but it's just the best word that we can use in English. So there's faith towards this other power, and if you have the faith towards this other power, you can attain Satori, or enlightenment. So those were the different fundamental differences.
Follow-up to that, you mentioned Reverend Izumi indicated that if you read Nishida, that could unlock some sort of truths of Buddhism, which sounded interesting because Nishida is so closely associated with Zen, Nishitani is so closely associated with Zen, as you mentioned. Abe moves away from Shin Buddhism to Zen. Did Izumi mention Tanabe? Did he say maybe read Tanabe Hajime instead?
No, he didn't.
He didn't push the Shin
No,
figure at all.
he was
okay
very
with
serious
Zen.
about Nishida.
Yeah.
And-
Because this ties into a larger discussion that comes out of Japan at the time too, where D.T. Suzuki, the one that many of us in the West know best, was a good friend of Nishida's. They were childhood buddies, and they influenced each other's thought a bit. And D.T. Suzuki, like Nishitani after him, also served as the editor of the Eastern Buddhist Journal, great journal, headquartered at Otani University, which is the Jodo Shinshu headquarters of one side of Pure Land Buddhism. So even Nishitani as a Zen figure was surrounded by all of these Shin figures, these Pure Land figures. Same was true for G.T. Suzuki, and toward the end he started to write more about Pure Land. So he came about with his own answer to that, what's different between Zen and Pure Land or Shin, and he started to use, again, mining Nagarjuna, he would talk about form and emptiness. He would say, ultimately they're the same, but Shin or Pure Land emphasizes form, saying the Nimbutsu, talking about gratitude, depictions of the Pure Land, all that kind of form. And Zen emphasizes emptiness and absolute emptiness and absolute nothingness and the rest of it, but he kind of brings them together. So yeah, a lot of these figures you're talking about are swimming in these same waters that have these Zen dimensions to them and these Jodo Shinshu dimensions, but Izumi didn't push you toward the Jodo Shinshu ones.
No, and what's interesting too in Western philosophy, with the OGs, right, the original gangsters of Plato, Aristotle. We wouldn't be able to define them as either analytical or continental, but for some reason it's split right now in modern academics. There's this definitive split between continental and analytic. I see it all the time in my degree, even in the 2 years I've been in it. But both parties reference the OGs. And I see that happening in Japan too, with the Zen and the Shins, and referencing some of the early thinkers.
Other questions or comments?
Great, thank you again. Shockingly right on time. So lunch is up next with that same warning to not steal the food of vegetarians if you didn't register. And then the next
Say hi to Courtney.
in at 12:45 if you want to start.